As for tonight, this is the last, I think, event curated around the launch of Ugly Duckling Presse's 2020 pamphlet series. It's fitting, I think, for 2020 that it's happening in April of 2021. Several years ago at UDP, we decided to do something different with our publishing practice in the year 2020 and take something of a break from our rather rigorous publishing schedule of more than 20 books a year to focus on the present moment and concerns about subjects close to our longstanding commitments: collective work, translation, performance, pedagogy, poetics, and small press publishing, to explore new approaches to working in the present, an engagement at once sustained and ephemeral. If you didn't get a chance to get these pamphlets, you still can. You can find the entire series as well as the individual pamphlets on our website. And if you do decide to purchase one or more, you'll be fortunate to have both brain and heart full with these really outstanding essays and interventions. Tonight's event comes out of some of the thinking that led to the series and from the ideas proposed in some of the pamphlets. Don Mee Choi's essay in UDP pamphlet, "Translation is a Mode, Translation is an Anti-neocolonial Mode," grows out of a keynote lecture that Don Mee gave at the American Literary Translators Association conference in 2016. In it, she explores translation and language in the context of US imperialism through the eyes of a so-called foreigner, a translator, a child in Tomoka, a made-up city of Ingmar Bergman's The Silence, a child from a neo-colony. She speaks, she writes, as the twin. The force of Don Mee's thinking, writes Joelle McSweeney, lies in this counter-colonial model. Here tonight to read and discuss their own work, their expanded translation practices, and their relations to Don Mee's essay are Mirene Arsanios, Mónica de la Torre, Sawako Nakayasu, and Sawako Nakayasu. After their presentations, they will be a part of a discussion moderated by Esther Allen. I will introduce them all now, and then each will present without further interruption from me. Mirene Arsanios is the author of the short story collection, The City Outside the Sentence. She's contributed essays and short stories to Efflux Journal, Vita, the Brooklyn Rail, and Guernica, among others. Arsanios co-founded the collective 98 Weeks research project in Beirut and is the founding editor of Magazine, a bilingual English-Arabic magazine for innovative writing. She teaches at the Pratt Institute. Her UDP pamphlet, Notes on Mother Tongues, explores language as a field shaped by diasporic histories, class relations, and broken familial legacies. It strives to imagine mother tongues and motherhood beyond the labor of reproduction, languages that exist in troubled ecosystems where lack does not preclude repair. Mónica de la Torre's books include Repetition 19 and The Happy End, All Welcome, as well as public domain and talk shows. She's the translator of Defense of the Idol by Chilean modernist Omar Cáceres and is a member of the editorial board of the Señal series at Ugly Duckling Press. She's a contributing editor to Bomb magazine and teaches poetry at Brooklyn College. 25 unreliable translations of a poem in her first book written in Spanish form the heart of her recent Nightboat book in English, Repetition 19. The poems in this collection are based on slippages between languages and irreverent approaches to translation and riff on creative misunderstanding in response to the prevailing political discourse. Sawako Nakayasu is an artist working with language, performance, and translation, separately and in various combinations. Her books include The Ants, Texture Notes, the translation of Tatsumi Hijikata's Costume en Face, a primer of darkness for young boys and girls, and Mouth Eats Color, Sagawa Chika translations, anti-translations, and originals, a multilingual book of both original and translated poetry. She teaches at Brown University. Her UDP pamphlet, Say Translation is Art, is a treatise on literary translation that exceeds the bounds of conventional definitions of such, advocating for a wider embrace of translation as both action and as art. And finally, our illustrious moderator tonight is Esther Allen. Esther co-curated with Allison Markin Powell Translating the Future, the 2020 online conference commemorating the 50th anniversary of the US's first International Literary Translation Conference. Her translation of Zama by Antonio Di Benedetto won the 2017 National Translation Award. She teaches at Baruch College and the City University of the New York Graduate Center, where she is working on the 2022 relaunch of the translation track of the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies. Excuse me. Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Mirene Arsanios.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yes, awesome. Hi everyone, so many people. I'm a little nervous, but yeah, I want to thank everyone, really. Thank you so much, UDP, Rebecca, Madve, Esther, Amy, Raphael, and everyone who has organized this event in the Center of Humanities at CUNY as well. I'm so honored to be reading with Sawako and Mónica. And yeah, I'm going to be reading a short kind of response to Don Mee Choi's essay. It's very new and a little rough, so just sort of adding a last sentence just now. So it's still in the making. But yeah, it explores some ideas that I've been interested in lately, around gibberish and the acquisition of language. So I'm gonna take it a little bit on a tangent, but hopefully I don't stray too far from Don Mee Choi's arguments. And if I do, maybe that will sort of also generate some kind of interesting conversation, hopefully. The short response is about 8 minutes, and then I'm going to be reading just like a page and a half from my own UDP pamphlet, which has post-it notes on it. But here it is. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's a little blurry. Anyways, okay. Oh yeah, there it is on Rebecca's screen. So the response doesn't really have a title yet. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. So, in Translation is a Mode, translation is an anti-colonial mode, Don Mee Choi discusses the deformation zone, an expression she borrows from Joel McSweeney and Johannes Gorenson's UDP manifesto of the same title. Choi writes, quoting, "Translation is both a thing, a substance, a material, and a conveyance, a way that one material is converted to another form. In the deformation zone, translation is a wound that makes impossible connections between languages, unsettling stable ideas of language, productive ideas of literature," end of quote. In the deformation zone, language is subjected to a passage in which it undergoes an irreversible transformation. Its substance is altered on a molecular level. I think of the deformation zone in Tarkovskian terms, a space in which the laws of physics as we know them no longer apply. The deformation zone isn't a happy place, but it is a place of possibility, perhaps one of the very few, a zone in which language is shattered and newly configured. I'd like to pause and linger within the deformation zone. What happens when we suspend the conveyance from one language to another? When the zone is no longer bordered by an outside? What happens when we lose the possibility of connections between languages, of translation itself? When we're stuck in a field in which language, without referent, is distorted to a point of non-recognition? What language would be spoken then, if any? Choi expands her reading of the deformation zone with The Silence, a Bergman movie in which two estranged sisters, Hannah, a beautiful, seductive mother, and Esther, a Nil translator prone to coffin fits, embark on a trip in what appears like a war-torn country. Both Esther and her nephew, Johan, seem to be prone to foreign words, and therefore to homesickness, Choi writes. When Esther and Johan encounter an unknown and most probably made up language posted on the glass window of a cabin, Johan asks his aunt, "What does it mean?" "I don't know," she replies. When faced with a language that isn't one, Esther the translator suddenly becomes powerless. Gibberish cannot be translated. It is absolutely foreign, a language existing outside any known codification or established place of origin. Choi's evocation of gibberish in The Silence brings to mind Poto and Gabengo, a 1980 Jean-Pierre Gorin documentary about identical twins who used an invented language until the age of 8. Midway through the documentary, a voiceover states that you can only be a foreigner in a language other than your own. But these two were foreigners in their own language. End of quote. Did the twins of Poto and Gabengo ever feel homesick when speaking their own language? Is it possible to feel nostalgic for a home that never existed in the first place? If the colonized subject experiences an inherent twinness that divorces them from a so-called mother tongue, what kind of subjecthood is performed in gibberish? Before we acquire a mother tongue, there is a time in which we babble, mostly nonsensical sounds. We try out sentences in awe and confusion before the syllables coming out of our mouths. We mimic the language of the world while existing in a zone parallel to it. My 19-month-old son's babbles are turning into increasingly recognizable words. Sometimes I'm able to translate him, and sometimes, like Esther, I don't know what he is saying. In an extraordinary book on language titled Ecolalias on the Forgetting of Language, author Daniel Heller Rosen writes that, quote, "A babbling child can accumulate articulations which are never found within a single language or even a group of languages. Consonants with the more varied points of articulations, sibilants, affricates, clicks, complex vowels, and so on and so forth. Infants are capable of everything. Without the slightest effort, they can produce any and all sounds contained in human language." End of quote. When the infant acquires a mother tongue and becomes versed in the finite system and consonants and vowels of a single language, she loses access to the multitude her babbles once contained. As if the acquisition of a single language was premised on the erasure or forgetting of all the others. Following this line of argument, one could say that translation isn't a place of foreignness, but exactly the opposite. The distorted sounds of a language in deformation is the closest definition of home. The deformation zone is where speech originates. Conversely, to have a mother tongue is to lose your proximity to others, to become a foreigner to yourself. I'm not sure how to connect my interest in gibberish to colonial or neocolonial modes. Perhaps I'm talking about an affect, a desire to reverse the nostalgia of the missing or violated mother tongue or land by sending back a mirror image to the colonizer, a reflection devoid of distortion. The colonizing logic of the American empire exists outside of the deformation zone and lives in terror of it. The American empire is a space of anti-translation. From within the zone, I learn how to listen to a language I might never understand, but probably once knew. So this is the end of my little response to Don Mee Choi's essay. And should I read my excerpts from my pamphlet now? Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna read quickly a page and a half from my pamphlet. I think almost halfway through it. And as Rebecca said, the pamphlet sort of explores mother tongues in relation to a history of colonization, which is itself informed by a history of class relations. So my language would sneak into Maria's room at night to count the coins she collected in a blue ceramic jar. My language didn't trust Maria because her mother distrusted Maria. She would say, Maria's jealous of me. She wants the things I have. While sipping from a glass of afternoon wine, her legs crossed, leather shoes dangling from her hardened heel. My language was brought up with betrayal never lurking very far. Inevitably, one morning, Maria, Consuelo, and Cristina were gone, their bed still undone, the coin jar emptied. An archetypal scene of fugitivity, fleeing the children they cared for those they had left behind with a sister, mother, or cousin. My language loved the women who were paid to take care for her the way her mother loved Elsa. The bourgeoisie can only love the working class if the latter is powerless and dependent. The affection my language felt towards Maria or her mother felt for Elsa is only possible when the other exists to serve you. Without subjugation, there isn't any love. My language believes you cannot be a language before you acknowledge the genealogies of care and abuse that have produced you as a language. When my language says you, she means you too. My language isn't exposing her history so that she can be absolved from it. There is no such thing as absolution. But my language believes in the possibility of breaking the cycle of love and negation by generating ascending legacies, mother tongues decoupled from biological mothers, languages coming to us from future sentences. My language can't look at her son without thinking about her dead parents. Perhaps it is the surplus of life a baby comes with, an excess evocative of its opposite. My language knows that she owes her life to the dead. To speak a mother tongue is to find a language to speak with those who no longer have a language. My language doesn't have a mother tongue because she can't speak with the dead. My language can't speak of the dead, but she cannot speak with them. To speak with the dead would require abandoning the theory embedded in the discourse my language has become, the contrived and obfuscating language she sometimes borrows from the living. But my language hasn't found a way not to be a language, a device that brings you closer to reality by distancing you from it. There are layers of opacity between my language and herself that can only be peeled away in writing. This language, my language, writes all these words in the hope that the dead can read it, English. And I'm going to end here. Thank you.
So now,
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much for gathering us. I just so love being in conversation with Mirene, Sawako, Esther, Rebecca, Matve, Kendra, Graduate Center, everyone. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with this beautiful pamphlet that's just so evocative and full of things that I would like to respond to. In fact, so much so that I should just read the entire thing, but I won't. I have been summoned to pick an excerpt and respond to it, and I will do that. So I will begin with a part that sends us back to, of course, Benjamin's task of the translator. The title itself does this by inserting anti-colonial to the translation as a mode. Translation is an anti-colonial mode, which is something that means a lot to me in the sense that I think in the right hands, translation can be an anti-colonial mode, even though historically it has been often the opposite. So then Don Mee Choi goes to the notion of pure language in the Benjamin essay. And I'm reading now. The sum of all the languages of the world with brought and pain as examples of words that have different modes of intention but mean the very same thing. But if I were to dislocate Benjamin's brought and pain into Korea's neocolonial zone, they would probably encounter another word for bread, pang. The Korean word for bread, pang, is obviously a transformation or deformation of the French word pain. It is also likely that it arrived in Korea already deformed through a Japanese deformation zone. And if I were to add oksusu, and pardon my mispronunciation of the Korean, which means corn, in front of pang, it becomes oksusu pang. Cornbread and oksusu pang do intend the same object and may even taste the same, except that they arise from very different historical and political intentions. Oksusu pang was fed to school children in South Korea after the Korean War. It was intended as food aid from the US. So my tongue, even before I had ever encountered the English language, was a site of power takeover, war, wound, deformation, and ultimately, and already, motherless. What makes oksusupang cornbread most remarkable is not that seemingly benign humanitarian intention behind it, but the fact that on a local, bodily, tongue level, it creates involuntary longing, a lifelong craving, which could easily be translated as a desire to be colonized. And it certainly is translated this way at the level of US foreign policy, particularly at the level of military maneuvers. But my tongue deforms, it disobeys. I translate this longing, entangled with neocolonial dependency, as homesickness, which is a form of illness, a form of intensity. And after Don Mee Choi talks about the movie that Mirene wrote about in her response, The Silence, the Bergman movie, The Silence, then she goes back to gibberish, which I also responded to, and I will redo this section of the pamphlet. I could instantly recognize Bergman's made-up gibberish language because that is how English appeared to me when I was growing up in South Korea. I pretended to be a foreigner, pretending to write in English because I thought my father, who was frequently away from home for work, was a foreigner and wanted to be like him. What I wrote was pure gibberish. So gibberish, foreign words, incomprehensibility was my very first encounter with intensive form. I pretended to be a foreigner even before I really became one. As a foreigner, as foreign words myself, I seek incomprehensibility, a mirror image of myself. I seek mirrors through which I can also traverse in order to map out the neocolonial history of my home, to translate myself. Like Esther in The Silence, I also live inside the mirror, the intensifier, the site of my neocolonial translation. Mirrors may be my very own cubbyhole. So in my book, Repetition 19, I have, as Rebecca mentioned, 25 different translations and then annotations. So I will read some of the poems and their notes, which sometimes take the form of poems, sometimes take the form of essays on translation. But before I go there, I'll read one poem that I think establishes also my allegiance with disobeying as a mode. Okay, the poem's called Isometry. Gaze trained on gaze, positioned in front of the groove between mirror panels. Split, wobbling at the edges of both frames during tree pose particularly. A translation is moving every point of a shape that same distance in the same direction. Not ambidextrous, I keep silent. I understand the dilemma of playing protagonist. Prefer a supporting role, the only part of your body remaining undisciplined, detached. I am disobedient, writes my left hand. And apropos of pretending to be a foreigner, my experience with English relates to that. even before I wrote in English, I was already sort of pretending. So this is an annotation to a translation that I will not read you, but the translation takes the form of a prose poem. It's peach season again. I happen to be wearing a white t-shirt. I also happen to be eating a peach. At some point, the juice slides down my fingers onto my white t-shirt. This happens repeatedly, all beachy, since I'm not one for spick and span. She once was a spick in the eyes of the paterfamilias. I shouted out if the shout's available to me. He might have been teasing. Fastidious is another false friend. Fussy here, there, a drag. Shouting sometimes sets the stain, hence the camouflage. She was me and I was her during the summer spent here visiting from Mexico City, when she imagined that the sustained performance in which she played an American teenager was convincing to the kids on the block with whom she hung out and bonded even. Concealment achieved not through erasure, but through cluttering the surface where the thing appears amid elements competing for attention. But right under the slang she feigned being fluent in, there was another vernacular that would slacken her tongue, leading to the embarrassment of saying the right thing wrongly or the wrong thing flat out. She said, "This happened to me and became me." Once I asked what made a poem. No one replied. I only remember the episode because someone else remembered it for me. Esta lengua dislocada, bella nadadora, desviada para siempre de su rol acuático y puramente acariciador. Altazor. If the tongue were a beautiful swimmer. Fuzzy peach. So the poem in question is, as I said, a poem in Spanish written in the 90s, and I will read you the poem. So I will read you the poem in Spanish, and then I'm going to read you some unreliable translations and their annotations. So, equivalencias. Uno, un silencio, una llamarada. Un sorbo de café antes de que supiera amargo. Un hoyo dentro de un agujero. Dos caminos para una trayectoria y sus ojos cerrados durmiendo la siesta. ¿Cuántos espejos son dos? Cae la tarde y aparecen dos luces. Dos hijos que ya son tres. Tres es paz y garantía. Un cómplice, un enemigo. Tres libros abiertos, tres granos de sal. 4 veces dije un nombre y nada. 4 es lo mismo que 2. Y si 5 veces te preguntas qué hago aquí, quema tu cama, déjala arder y vete. So the first translation I will read you was produced by Google Translate a while ago. It is an app that keeps evolving, as you know, but here's the translation. Equivalences. One silence, a flash, a sip of coffee before I knew bitter. A hole in a hole. 2 paths to a path and his eyes closed napping. Many mirrors are twofold. Late afternoon and see 2 lights, 2 suns, and 3. 3 is peace and security, an accomplice or an enemy. 3 books open, 3 grains of salt. 4 times the name and nothing said. 4 is the same as 2. And if you ask 5 times, what am I doing here? Burning your bed, let it burn and go. The annotation for it examines the biases and problems that Google Translate introduces. So here we go. Apropos of commonplaces, who doesn't consult their device when unsure as how to move forward? Enter Google Translate, the most neutral of readers, perhaps the best possible one since it has no preconceived knowledge of what it translates or the context of an utterance. And in producing literal translations makes not only, as Borges would put it, for uncouthness and oddity, but also for strangeness and beauty, end of quote. It avoids reading into a text and does not differentiate between, say, a poem, a legal document, or spam. It takes words at face value since, as David Bellows explains, it doesn't deal with meaning at all. Instead of taking a linguistic expression that requires decoding, GT, Google Translate, takes it as something that has probably been said before. It uses vast computing power to scour the internet in the blink of an eye looking for an expression in some text that exists alongside its paired translation, end of quote. Although GT's methods continue to be perfected, and improved translations will surely be part of the corpus it combs through in a matter of seconds by the time you read these observations, we can glean some of its biases from its translation of equivalencias. For starters, GT's most egregious bias applying to any translation of poetry is that it expects everything not only to have been said before, but to be locatable on the internet, therefore making it ill-suited to render inventive, novel poetic utterances into another language. Predictably, when GT is presented with multiple options, it cannot infer which the most pertinent one is given the context. Consider, for instance, its treatment of the verb saber, which means both to know and to taste, apropos of tongues. In relation to a sip of coffee, the obvious choice would be to taste, but GT went for to know. Can it be true that no one ever translated the phrase antes de que supiera amargo before, referring to the coffee before it acquired a bitter taste? That said, GT's mistaken inference produced a line that is not devoid of charm in a certain trueness. One sip of coffee before I knew better. It signals phenomenological awareness by fusing the perception of an object's qualities with the perceiver and pointing to the fact that the taste of coffee is not per se unpleasant, but only in the estimation of the person sipping it. When there is ambiguity as to the subject of a sentence, GT's translations are skewed towards the first person. In that same construction cited above, the conjunction of the verb supiera in Spanish would allow for the subject of the sentence to be the first or third person singular. GT predictably assigned the tasting to an I. GT translates sequentially from one syntactical unit to another. It is for this reason that it cannot deduce meaning for what comes after a unit it has already converted to the target language. Complicating matters, GT has short-term memory only and therefore scrambles agreement and adjective order. GT is indifferent to stylistic conventions, as evinced by the lines a hole in a hole and two paths to a path. It incurs the type of repetition avoided in so-called well-written texts by the usage of synonyms and the display of a rich vocabulary. In addition, GT is male-centered and tone-deaf. Eyes cannot just be shut while napping. They must belong to a male. And children, or offspring, must all be sons. In Spanish, and if the I misses accents, questions without question marks cannot be identified. Hence the question, ¿cuántos espejos son dos? How many mirrors are two? Implied only by the accent over the A differentiating the word from many, ¿cuántos without an accent, becomes the winning, many mirrors are twofold. GT, not unlike the worst translators, is also prone to providing unnecessary elucidations of what it fails to understand in a rather simple or clear text. Since evenings cannot fall and lights cannot just appear out of the blue, it introduces the subject seeing them. The line evening falls and two lights appear therefore becomes late afternoon and see two lights. In the third stanza, instead of a comma, it introduces or between an accomplice and an enemy, since given that the terms are opposites, it deems it a contradiction for someone to be both simultaneously. GT misses the point the line seeks to underscore, that from the perspective of a subject in a group of three individuals, one of the other two will be an accomplice of the first, and the third one an enemy. Finally, again, not unlike dangerously inept translators who, in Walter Benjamin's characterization, practice the inaccurate transmission of an inessential content, GT fails to read those smaller words on which sense tends to rest disproportionately, perhaps, pronouns and prepositions. GT failed to take note of the self-reflexive nature of the question in the fifth stanza. If 5 times you ask yourself, what am I doing here? Simply becomes, and if you ask 5 times, what am I doing here? GT equal defamiliarization 101. The estrangement, the omission of the reflexive pronoun introduced is more than welcome since it rids the stanza of its heavy dose of self-involvement and it signals the subject's disorientation more genuinely. GT's output is inventive in that it cannot simply replicate existing discourse ad nauseum, but invariably mangles it, and in doing so introduces a generative swerve. And apropos of gibberish, I'm just going to read you one more translation. And this was activated by, it was produced by the voice recognition software associated with GT. So it's the same poem, and the title is Equivalence. It got that right. But then We have this. January, one flare, silently sipped coffee before a super bitter self into a hole. Two paths as a path and his eyes closed, napping as many mirrors. Evening falls and two lights appear and are three Don Quixote. Press space, guarantee, an accomplice, an enemy, 3 books, open, 4 months, a man says nothing, 4 is the same as 2, 5 times, and if you wonder why I'm here burning gel, drum great, song, and old age. And just a brief note on that translation. Here we go. For equivalence, I read the poem into GT app on my device, then on an iPhone 5. The results were hardly as advanced as the ones in which a person who doesn't know the language understands something. The fact that the app required to first transcribe the text and then translate it into English accounts for the extreme randomness of the results. Many more than 1 in 7 or 8 words seem to be wild guesses on GT's parts. The inference that what the speaker of the poem was saying somehow related to Don Quixote, given that, like Cervantes' novel, it too had been written in Spanish, flatters the work and beckons Borges and his forgiving approach to translation. Contrary to what authors and readers hold as an article of faith when it comes to editions and translations, in The Superstitious Ethics of the Reader from 1931, Borges equates preciousness in a literary text with its precariousness, reassuring us that the page that becomes immortal can traverse the fire of typographical errors, approximate translations, or inattentive or erroneous readings without losing its soul in the process. One cannot alter with impunity any line fabricated by Góngora, according to those who restore his text, writes Borges, but Don Quixote wins posthumous battles against his translators and survives each and every careless version. End of quote. It is characteristically sly of Borges to have imperviousness to error act as a guarantor of the text's afterlife, and even more so to bring up the translators of Don Quixote, since the first one appears in the novel and thus is entirely fictional. The narrator claims that the book he has been recounting up to the chapter 8 has abruptly come to an end, and that the story has been able to continue only due to a serendipitous encounter with a purveyor of rare books and manuscripts in a market. One such manuscript contained the novel's alleged Arabic original by Cid Hamet de Benengeli, whose translation the narrator commissions. From that moment on, whenever something doesn't sit well with the novel's narrator, he reliably blames the translator. So with that, I'll end. And yes, that notion of even canonical masterpiece such as Don Quixote posits itself to be a translation, and a quite unreliable one at that. Thank you.
Hello, should I just jump in? Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you to Rebecca and Motve and everyone at UDP and CUNY for organizing this. Thanks to everyone who helped and contributed and helped make this happen, possibly behind the scenes. Thanks to Mirene and Mónica and Esther. It's so, so wonderful to be in conversation with you. I am going to begin by reading a little bit of my pamphlet, which is called Say Translation is Art. This is the last little bit. Say, two-legged human being, female, lesbian, musician, composer, among other things, translation, Pauline Oliveros. Say, what you can do to help if you'd like to is to call your families, your bosses, your landlords, your friends, everyone you know, and come out of the closet as queer, translation, C.A. Conrad. Say, overcoming heteronormatively naturalized desires by learning to recognize all naturalized desires, such as the desire for a certain kind of beauty in translation, Paul Preciado. Say, desire wears the mask of naturalization. Say, translation is a process of denaturalization, which is also a means of decolonizing desire. Say, suspicion in all that appears to be natural translation, all that appears to be compulsorily able-bodied translation. Joel McSweeney, Johannes Goranson. Say, I translate with my body. Say, my body is not the same as your body, Kate Briggs. In fact, say, my body produces bags of shit, one heat-seeking bag of shit and another heat-seeking bag of shit translation, translation into and out of continuous inferno, translatable bags of shit. Because we cannot scream, we translate. Daniel Borzutsky. Say, translation as a means of denaturalizing desire in language as rehearsal for denaturalizing, decolonizing, and overall flat out liberating desire in real, actual, lived life. Hooray. Say, fluent, easy, legible, clear, lucid, readable translation. Say, yes, and but. Say, translation at the edges of perception. Say, do you really want to be defined by your limitations? Translation. Say, aesthetics over politics. Translation. Say, politics over aesthetics. Translation. Say, nation state. Translation. Say, I'm over that nation state. Translation. Say, back translation from the colonial language original to the home language translation, writing in a colonial language already a translation before having been written at all, Yisang. Say, treacherous translation, translation both pointing out the gulf and trying to bridge the distance, Cirque So. Say, I refuse to translate, Don Mee Choi. Say, I'm not here just to close the distance, translation. Say, shift in parameters, translation. Say, sense is not everything, translation. Say, translate just the sounds, just the syntax, just the awkwardness, just the wildness. Translation no more impossible than art. Say, ambient translation. Say, magical neo-translation. Say, outsider translation. Say, diasporic translation as a means of widening conversation about race, John Keane. Say, distributed centrality translation that washes away the notion of the margin, Lisa Samuels. Say, ultra translation, Jen Hoffer, J.D. Pluker. Say, dialect translation. Say, spoken translation. Say, accent translation. Say, second language translation, stepmother tongue translation, Taylor Mack and Judy translations. Say, here, not here, there, not here, translation. Say, how now, corrupt loyalty, fidelity to what, translation. Say, vomit translation. Say, diarrhea translation. Say, logorrhea translation. Say, I translate because I vomit because I translate, and yet. Say, how infinitely complex any move for liberation must be, translation, Audre Lorde. Say, break and rebuild everything via translation. Say, free translation. I say it, I do translate like that and also like this, but there's more to that story, translation, more to that arc, art, ball in the air, translation. I pitch it to you, still in the air, translation. Okay, so that was a little bit of Say Translation as Art. And now I'm going to try to weave in some of that and some of my thoughts about Don Mee Choi's pamphlet. Just also thinking about how I ended the pamphlet with translation as a ball in the air, and there's something that's still in the air. There's a little bit of ambivalence in the air, but also a sense of aliveness, like in sports, the ball, depending on the sport, is alive while it's midair and dies when it lands. But coming from my thinking that what I'm interested in is in looking at alternative metaphors for translation. So I'm trying to unsettle its definitions, break it open into a wider space. Often translation, or traditionally, it often uses metaphors of linear movement, of transit or transport or conveyance. Or we have someone like Laurie Chamberlain, her essay, Gender and the Metaphorics of Translation, where she considers the gender dynamics of the metaphors that we use, the power hierarchies that are built into the language we've inherited around translation. And she also mentions the mother tongue. She writes, quote, "The fundamental problem remains the same. how to regulate legitimate sexual, parentheses, authorial relationships and their progeny. Now, when I'm thinking about Don Mee Choi and how she considers the forces of patriarchy, nationalism, militarism, and the geopolitical circumstances that shaped her life, she writes, quote, "Translation is a map, a mode that can trigger endless crossings from one party to another, quote within a quote, neither of whom has seen," end to all quotes. These alternative modes of translation is in contrast to what I now think of as naturalized desires for translation, which is a concept I teased out of Paul Preciado's wonderful book, The Counter-Sexual Manifesto. If we had more time, I would tell you all about the dildos in it. He writes, "Sexualities are like languages. They're complex systems of communication and reproduction of life. As languages, sexualities are historical constructs with common genealogies and biocultural inscriptions. Like languages, sexualities can be learned. Multiple languages can be spoken. As is often the case within monolingualism, one sexuality is imposed on us in childhood, and it takes on the character of a naturalized desire." At some point, I sat down and counted all the naturalized desires that I was holding in my bag. The notion of naturalized desires is interesting to me because of the way a colonized mind also naturalizes the desires of the forces in power. Don Mee Choi, in her discussion about bread, brought, pan, pang, pang, where she discusses the Korean cornbread, oksusupang, she's twinning Benjamin's brat and pan into cornbread and oksusupang. Later on, so we can hearken back to Mónica reading from this section, and I'm going to read this too. What makes oksusupang cornbread most remarkable is not the seemingly benign humanitarian intention behind it, but the fact that on a local bodily tongue level, it creates involuntary longing, a lifelong craving, which could easily be translated as a desire to be colonized. And it certainly is translated this way at the level of US foreign policy, particularly at the level of military maneuvers. But my tongue deforms, it disobeys. So here comes her resistance to the neocolony. I translate this longing entangled with neocolonial dependency as homesickness, which is a form of illness, a form of intensity. So I'm interpreting that cornbread and the conditioning of the colonized body and the creating of this involuntary longing, these all read to me as akin or siblings to Preciado's naturalized desires. Mirene names some naturalized desires in her pamphlet also. So I'm quoting from Notes on Mother Tongues. Her mother wanted my language to be like her, to desire the same middle-class heteropatriarchal life she, her mother, had chosen. When I think about an anti-neocolonial mode of translation, I see that Don Mee Choi has effectively escaped some naturalized modes of translation, leaping out of the supposedly pure mode of Benjamin into a mode of translation that is specific to her cultural, historical, geopolitical experiences, engagements, and urgencies. She's not suggesting, I think, that everyone become an anti-neocolonial translator just like her, but instead, I take the suggestion to be just as individual as she is in considering how to build one's own relationship to literature and to writing. I'm thinking too in this context about how my own history intersects with Don Mee Choi's history. My heritage language, Japanese, being the colonial language, not only for Korea, but for countless countries and people in Asia via the vastness of the legacy of the Japanese Empire. So strangely, my father's got the taste of kimchi on his tongue as from his position of being part of the occupation in Korea. His father was a journalist and my dad was a child there. Quoting Don Mee Choi again, "I'm not content to just go from Korean to English. I'm not content to uphold the notion of national literature, the notion that literature outside of the Western canon is always bound to national borders. What this implies is that the so-called national literature simply needs to cross linguistic and national borders, as if such borders are entirely ahistorical and apolitical. Whenever poet Kim Hae-soon is asked whether her poetry represents her country, a question that is rarely asked of a poet whose work is perceived to be rooted in the Western canon, she never fails to answer that her poetry comes from the Republic of Kim Hae-soon. I want to make impossible connections between the Korean and the English, for they are misaligned by neo-colonial war, militarism, and neoliberal economy. The two languages have very little in common linguistically, yet they are of one tongue, almost, because in a neo-colonial zone, as Deleuze and Guattari have already noted, quote, "There's no mother tongue, only a power takeover by a dominant language," end quote within quote. I've done that twice now. A different kind of power takeover in Mirene's pamphlet, I want to point out, where she describes her acquisition of the maternal language via surrogate mothers in the form of hired domestic help. My language, quote, "My language comes from a genealogy of maternal divestment and surrogate love in which those poorer and darker are tasked with the labor of care. This generational practice has become its own language, a mother tongue of sorts. The displaced mother makes me think of orphans or the mirror words." And this line from DMZ Colony by Don Mee Choi, "Mirror words are orphan words." I also think of the paternalistic nature of colonialism and of a poet like Yi Song, the Korean modernist, who at first wrote in Japanese because that was the language he was permitted to use. Colonialism creating the orphan state. I'm also thinking about the original poem in your book, Mónica, in Repetition 19, as another kind of orphaned text written 20 years ago and abandoned. And also as if you wrote that poem 20 years ago in order to enable you to write this book 20 years later, which somehow explains the form that it takes, that a life accumulated is a repetition of the same one life over many iterations. But this multiplicity, I think, is a kind of a sibling to Don Mee Choi's twins. I'm also thinking about the language that arises from these interstices, the hybrid language, the mixed blood language in Mónica's work, and also in considering the gibberish in Don Mee Choi. I pretended to be a foreigner pretending to write in English because I thought my father, who is frequently away from home for work, was a foreigner and I wanted to be like him. What I wrote was pure gibberish. So gibberish, foreign words, incomprehensibility was my very first encounter with intensive form. Jumping back to Mirene, my language isn't exposing her history so that she can be absolved from it. There's no such thing as absolution, but my language believes in the possibility of breaking the cycle of love and negation by generating ascending legacies. I love this, ascending legacies. Mother tongues decoupled from biological mothers, languages coming to us from future sentences. Translation, end quote. Translation also serves to break cycles via decoupling, detaching, decolonizing. One of the beautiful and potent things about translation is that it begins by breaking something down. And the thought of translation as that combination of a breaking and a summoning of languages coming to us from future sentences, quoting Mirene, and in Don Mee Choi's words, I'm going to end with her words. Whether we are from here or elsewhere, whether we are foreigners or not, whether we speak silence, foreign words, gibberish, or English, I speak as a twin. I'll end there. Thank you.
That was so wonderful that the three of you have left me speechless. What to do when the moderator cannot speak? This is a really wonderful event for me for so many reasons. I was actually at the American Literary Translators Association in 2016 when Don Mee Choi, so were you, Sawako? And when she delivered this lecture, which overwhelmed me, astonished me, and I felt in that way that we sometimes do as a translator named Esther, her reflection upon a translator named Esther in this Bergman film, which I had never seen and which I went on to see, and which, if you have not seen it, oh my God, please see the Bergman film, The Silence. And so I felt that it was somehow directed at me. And of course, I have known Mónica for, gosh, I don't know, 30 years. And the essay on unreliable self-translation that's at the basis of, that was an essay that you published in the Translation Review. What was it, 10 years ago, 12 years ago?
I
It was a
don't
long
remember.
time ago.
A long time ago. It was the seed for this.
As soon as I read it, I said, this is what I need to teach my translation students at Baruch. And several times Mónica has been generous enough to come in and talk to the students about it. And they adore this essay because it teaches them something about themselves, which is what the most intimate writing quite often does. And I read Mirene's extraordinary sort of manifesto on mother tongues. And Mirene, I have to say that I was in mourning that we did not invite you to be part of Translating the Future. We have to somehow reconstitute the whole thing with you as part of it, because we had a whole series of things, a whole series of panels called Beyond the Mother Tongue. And I feel like your statement in this extraordinary pamphlet it encapsulates everything that everyone was trying to say in that series and takes it into a new direction. The through line that I see in all of this in your work, and why I think it was brilliant of Matvey to invite the three of you to comment on Don Mee Choi's remarkable essay, is the notion of translation in the context of caregiving, translation as a form of caregiving, as a very complex form of caregiving, a very fraught form of caregiving. And I hope you'll forgive me, but I want to share something, which is, I think, an attempt to be an act of caregiving, much in the way caregiving to translation itself, right? Which Don Mee is trying to care for translation, to make to raise translation so that it will be better than colonial, right? And I think all of us are in some way engaged in that. And recently I've been spending a lot of time looking at this 1970 volume, which was actually the basis. Can you see it? Oh, my screen is here, I'll put it right there. This was actually the basis for the Translating the Future conference. It was a panel, a huge conference that happened in 1970 in New York. And it begins with a Bill of Rights, a very short Bill of Rights. And since the language of Don Mee's essay in particular is so political, and I see something of the manifesto in Sawako's essay, and obviously caregiving involves obligations. Obligations are rights. The rights of the person cared for are the obligations of the caregiver. I thought it might be really interesting to share this 1970 Bill of Rights, developed by a group of white men, primarily in 1970, whose nation was supporting the dictator, Park Chung-hee, who forced Don Mee and her family to leave Korea. It's very short. And I think that it's actually trying to do certain things to offer caregiving to translation in ways that are not deeply removed from what you're doing, but the way in which it goes about it is so different. It's like a version, like an alternate version. Mónica, one of your versions, another attempt at the same thing, but much earlier in the genealogy of attempts. So this is 1970 Bill of Rights. It's unsigned, it's collective. Since translation of works of literature by the very nature of the task is the creation of a new work, the translator must be regarded as sovereign. The translator's chief obligation is to create the work in a new language with the appropriate music and the utmost response to the silences of the original. The unit in translation is the entire work, and the imagination of the translator is concerned above all with this unity. The privileges of the translator therefore include the right to be regarded as the maker of a new work, and he should be recompensed accordingly. His name shall be given a proper prominence, and he shall possess continuing rights over his work during its life. The honor of translation demands that translators of literary works shall in the future be regarded as artists rather than as skilled craftsmen. So I just wonder if any of you might have anything to say about that.
I was just wondering if that was your white man voice, Esther.
That was my white man voice. We actually have recordings of the 1970 conference, and it's amazing to hear the way that white men talked in 1970. It's just incredible. We think it was only William F. Buckley, but it was everybody.
Well, I think that that text is nice to hear in these strident terms, because it gives us something to bounce off of, and kind of it's like the growth chart or something. We can kind of measure ourselves against where we've been and where we are and what our values are and what the right unit is. I like that clarity on what the unit of a translation is, partly because I'm really interested in, I think units as a concept is interesting too. Our household operates on Celsius, or I operate on Celsius. My partner operates in Fahrenheit, and the kids are always frustrated and mad, but I'm interested in units on kind of a large scale. And in terms of translation too, I think a partial translation is fascinating to me. A unit that's larger than the one text is interesting to me. So these are questions of scale that I have enjoyed breaching in my own practice. If anyone wants to jump in and converse with another part of the treatise.
Or not, I just threw that out there as I don't know, a counterexample or a reminder of where we once were, some of us.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, I love that metaphor of the growth chart, because it totally feels that way. Although I do, not to contradict them, right, or the urgency of what they wanted to say at the time, but it does seem like even that wasn't one size fits all. Like, I mean, of course, the translator was more of an invisible back then, and therefore they felt very threatened by that invisibility. But I do think that it depended also on who the translator was and who the translated author was. There was certainly a hierarchy, and you would know much more about this, and stratification, and some rub off of capital that could come from the author. And so there were many celebrated translators of so-and-so, right? And so not all translators were invisible, in other words. Or I'm thinking, for instance, of Spivak as being, in one way, described as the celebrated translator of Derrida. So I'm just curious, maybe this is not a conversation, maybe it's just a tangent that's not worth really going into, but how that capital is distributed and generates other strata that, of course, to the general readership means nothing, because they don't even, it's like the fact that a work would be translated or not was perhaps even not of relevance back then to the general readership. But to others in the know, I do feel like there was a lot coming from the scale.
Mm-hmm. I want to go into that with you, Monica, because I think you are totally right in pointing out their desire to kind of build towards a translator celebrity culture. And it is kind of a piggybacking feeling of like grabbing some of that cultural capital, if I can call it that, and I think that I think some of what's interesting to me right now is thinking about translation as happening between human bodies, and these bodies move across the planet in certain ways. They interact with the bodies of possibly the person being translated. There's kind of I think there's an openness to the notion of who you translate, and even the notion of self-translation, which is, I've talked in other spaces about how there's a masturbatory quality to that, and there's something very interesting about affirming that as a metaphor for translation. And if it's not that, it might be something where you're translating the work of a friend. And I'm thinking about friendships like the book with Uljana Wolf and Sophie Seda, and how their translation and friendship and interaction as writers and translators is completely interwoven in that book. And it, like I used to think when I was a younger translator, I used to think that people translated their friends in some nepotistic way and it was lame. But now I see it very differently. I see it as friendships and relationships and conversation and community. And that can be even more meaningful than fame and glory and, achievement of that nature. So I think that I think those are useful sort of avenues of thinking about it.
I love your phrase, cultural capital power grab, Sawako, because it's so apparent there. Mirene.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about the treaties and the voice and the desire for this kind of cohesiveness or unity in relationship to GT and Google Translate. And although these two things might be sort of at first perceived as opposite, like Google Translate being like an anonymous kind of non-authorial way of translating, there's also something that connects them in the sort of desire for, I don't know, I mean, going back to capital, maybe like Google Translate being, the most sort of an algorithm that's deeply informed by, probably, the logic of the internet. And so, yeah, I was just I was thinking about Google Translate as a space that's, and Monica's work and her reflection on that as a space that exists in parallel to these like communities and bodies translating each other that Sawako was mentioning. And yet Google Translate is also so essential to so many people, is such an essential tool for understanding. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about the complexities of unity, and how translation exists, across these different sort of modes that are complicated, right? Yeah.
I think I read the manifesto because it says the translator is sovereign, and that relates absolutely to where Don Mee quotes Deleuze and Guattari saying there is no mother tongue, only a power takeover by a dominant language. And for somehow to posit the translator as sovereign, the translator then is becoming part of this power takeover as of a dominant language. What I loved in your essay, Mirene, it was that the translator as caregiver implies a translator who's not at all sovereign, but who in fact is defined more by their obligations, than by their power, the way one is in motherhood.
Right. I mean, I was thinking more of, the transmission of language not only happening via the mother, but also via surrogate mothers and caregivers that are paid workers and laborers. So in a way, like thinking about mother tongue as, like maybe sort of decoupling the affective dimension of the mother tongue, and sort of also de-essentializing and denaturalizing it, also to go back to Sawako's word, which I think is important, because I think the translator by definition is already denaturalized. So I don't know if to think of surrogacy as a sort of denaturalized sort of translator figure. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, and again, when thinking about the caregiver, I think it's important to think about labor and what Mónica was saying. So I'm trying to connect like translation to labor, to capital, and how it exists, you know, via, again, like probably the caregiver, but also Google Translate, and like all these sort of different ways in which caregiving is always a, you know, exists within also like a kind of an exploitative logic. So I don't know how to think of translation then, how it partakes in these dynamics. And I don't know if, I mean, if anyone has anything to say about that, but yeah.
Well, absolutely.
Mhm.
I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat, but people should definitely be putting their questions in the chat. Your essay, Mirene, made
Mhm.
me think about two recent films, Roma and Parasite,
Yeah.
both of which had that same sort of perception
Mhm.
of the
Right.
the caregiver, the person who is not the mother,
Mhm.
as playing
Mhm.
an extremely crucial role.
Exactly. Yeah, I loved both of these films actually. And actually I thought about, and I have this other project in which I want to talk more about, this other writing project that I thought about after watching Roma, and which is like, oh, I really want to talk about, you know, domestic workers in third world countries. They're such an essential part of, you know, the sort of middle bourgeoisie kind of class. So, but they're never talked about. And again, I was going back to the twinness that Don Mee Choi writes, because what I was trying to explore in the essay is that you can be both, you know, a kind of colonized subject, yet be in a position of power, and be also the recipient of, you know, a kind of be part of some kind of messed up class dynamic, right? And so I think that Don Mee Choi writes about that twinness, you know, the kind of complicated ambivalence of the colonized subject, when she also talks about, it's almost like she's exploring the coexistence between dissidents and subjection, and the longing to be colonized and the resistance to that colonization. So so I think that the caregiver, so to think about caregiving in these terms as well was important in relationship to class, was important for me. And I think we can also think of translation in relationship to class. Again, when you read the treaties, you know, what you know, what kind of, you know, you were saying that it was spoken by a particular group, but yeah, it's just it would be just interesting to think about historically that relationship and what it means. Yeah.
Someone in the chat has made a really interesting comparison between what you're saying about caregivers and the situation of the Poundian situation of translation, right? Of the native translator who works with the high artist translator who doesn't speak the language, but the native doesn't get compensated. It's interesting because we still see examples of something that looks like that model happening today. That still happens. And I wonder if anybody wanted to say anything in relation to that.
I was thinking of Roma too, actually. So it's interesting that telepathically we channeled Roma. And it's interesting. I mean, I keep thinking of Sawako's quoting of Preciado and that emphasis on sexuality, and Mirene, like I just love what you bring up, because in a place like Mexico, for instance, just the the problem is that things don't work in multiple directions, right? The unilateral way in which the power is distributed is the problem. Therefore, it's like you're hired to be mother, and the more care you shower on the child and the more you really kind of behave as if you were the mother, the better job you perform. Yet do not transmit language, your language, right? In Mexico, so many indigenous languages are spoken. If you actually, if the person hired to care for the child transmitted their language, then imagine that would be so subversive. It would be, right? It's like it's like, why don't we take that metaphor then and really subvert it and create multiple children in middle class and upper class families in Mexico City who speak indigenous languages because they were taught it by indigenous people who are actually working for them. That would be a beautiful model. It's like you replicate it up to a point, then the line is drawn, and then it's like, no, you're not going to be a mother that way. So I'm just like thinking about that. And also Glossolalia, that beautiful book, in which, of course, part of entering that economy consists of suppressing and repressing and forgetting your indigenous language, your original tongue, right? Your indigenous language. So I don't know. I think this is really
it's fantastic that you say that, Mónica.
Sorry, Esther.
Oh no, I just wanted to point out that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz actually spoke Nahuatl precisely because of that model. She grew up among Nahuatl people, and it was one of her first languages. So it has existed. Maybe it'll exist again. Sorry, Sawako.
No, I'm just I'm thinking about the way it's so interesting how Mirene has brought the thinking around class into the conversation, and in the ways that it intersects with Don Mee Choi's story about how her family had a home because of her father's photography, and he won a prize and they were able to live in a home. Meanwhile, there were all these children who were orphaned by the war, and they're roaming the streets and begging the food. And she's a child seeing other children who don't have families and don't have food. And so the concept of an orphan exists in actual literal terms in addition to linguistic conceptual terms. And then in the context of translation, Don Mee does this incredible thing. So this is in DMZ Colony. There's a whole section of poems that are written. The section is called The Orphans, and they are in the voice of orphans in that context in Korea, where we understand that she's kind of writing the original text on behalf of these orphans. Like, the texts were not actually written by them, but she's writing in their childish voice, in her own childish handwriting, because her handwriting is frozen in child version. Like my handwriting in Japanese also is frozen in child language. And then she translates that. So she's creating all these layers of texts before the translated product. It's so much about the process and the care and empathy for these other children who are in situations much less privileged than hers. And so that way of thinking about care and translation, I think, is really quite expansive and has a lot of potential for different ways of thinking about translation in the world. And that's kind of, these are links that are coming together thanks to the conversation. So just appreciating that.
We have one question in the chat. Thank you for this brilliant conversation. My question is, what if it is actually impossible to translate? For example, new languages developed to describe AIDS in various native African languages which have local meanings. What happens then to the figure of the translator?
There are two parts to the question. One is about impossibility, And one is about what happens then to the figure of the translator. That part I find interesting because part of the question is asking about a very pragmatic matter in the sense that there's a practical objective, and perhaps in that context the figure of the translator is a little bit less important than the matter of communication. And whether it's impossible or not, I think language is often making and remaking itself. So I imagine that language continues to make itself in the context that's required.
I love the impossible translation of okusupang, which is untranslatable precisely because it's totally translatable, because it's the absolute familiar substance that, you know, every American person has consumed over the course of their life and is a typical thing, but that is something completely different when consumed in the context of Korea. And so it's infinitely translatable. Cornbread, nothing's more familiar than that. And it's totally untranslatable because there's no way for us to understand what okusupang means in the context of Korea to a Korean person with this whole history of colonialism that comes with it. Perhaps it might be something like that.
Maybe one thing I would add is that just because something is resistant to translation or cannot be articulated in the language in which someone seeks to translate it into, does not mean that the thing should be invisible or not said. So in other words, untranslatability should not equal invisibility. Pointing to the thing that cannot be translated and creating a space for it to exist on its own, I think, is one of the things that translation can do. In fact, translation should not cover the thing and supplant it and make it seem as if the thing is conveyable in the language of the translation. It should point to its own insufficiency. I think if translation manages to do that, translation has done a good thing. So I think, yeah, to go back to what Esther was just saying, cornbread, because it's so translatable, is actually the most insufficient of translations, because it makes you think that you got what cornbread in Korea is. And guess what? It's not. Nothing could be more different than the cornbread that we know here, right? So that's what I would say. Yeah.
Mirene, do you want to jump in? No.
Sorry, I know I was just not really totally, happy with these two answers. Yeah.
There is a lot of stuff going on in the chat that I will direct everyone to, but I don't think we have any time left. Someone has even included a dictionary definition of cornbread or a thesaurus for cornbread, pointing out obviously that cornbread can also be very complex and freighted with different meanings in English, or at least I think that, it is even foreign to us. In other words, it comes from indigenous traditions and that we don't understand, that we should look at cornbread and understand how strange it is and how we have co-opted it and colonized it. I guess there's nothing left to do but to thank first and foremost Matvey and Rebecca, who have worked tirelessly for months to make this happen, and to thank everyone who came and shared in this brilliant conversation, and then most of all to thank Sawako, Mirene, and Mónica for an unforgettable evening. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you all so
Esther.
much.
Thanks, Mirene and Mónica, Rebecca, Matvey.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. We barely scratched the surface.
We
barely
scratched the surface. There's so much more to say.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Yeah.
It's
so many
pretty exciting that so many people were interested in hearing us talk about translation.
I am
that in itself
wildly excited about that. Yes. And a very encouraging one. And thanks to Don Mee. Oh my goodness.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, that's a big bravo.
Don Mee, if she watches the recording, or if she was lurking, who knows if she was lurking out there. Yeah, most of all, thanks to her.
Mhm. Brilliant work. Really, really
Mhm.
wonderful.
Yes.
Such a contribution.
Mhm.
Your pamphlets, I have to say, both the pamphlets are absolutely incredible. So
Yes.
Oh, the whole
Thank
series.
you. Yeah, the whole series.
I wanted to say something about how the whole series is breaking out of these cycles of what should be published and not, and what counts as literature. And there's just such a great range of the kinds of writing published by UDP. So hooray for that. Thank goodness for you.
Yeah, thanks,
I've loved the
UDP.
pamphlets. Really, really wonderful.
Mhm.
long live UDP.
Yay.
I don't know. That just rings of too much monarchy. Monica.
Maybe UDP should formulate a Bill of Rights, right? What would the UDP Bill of Rights look like? That would be interesting.
I mean,
Okay, everyone.
is so much about copyright, really, and about authorship and established. Like, I think it has a lot to do with what Sawako was getting at in terms of, following the thread of and the power takeover idea, and following that thread of, just there's a certain kind of even though they're trying to do something really good for the translator, it still follows a model of like ownership and authorial kind of control.
It's patriarchal.
Really, yeah, it's kind of surprising. I love of course, the he gives it away, but it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, there are some really nice things that they were trying to do there, but it's interesting how can we get there if we don't get out of those modes of that kind of ownership of the work.
They were paving the way for us, but I don't think they knew that they were paving the way for us. They couldn't imagine us.
They were paving their own way, as we should too. But I'm also thinking that there are some cool people in the audience, and maybe some of you want to jump in the conversation, perhaps.
Yeah, if you want to say something, you could raise your hand and we can unmute you. Or maybe I can make it for
Oh, I
everybody.
see. They do
Sure.
not have the power to unmute.
Yeah, make a comment. Yeah.
Or not. It's okay.
It's getting past your bedtime.
It is indeed.
I was just thinking about you getting up at 4 a.m. So
yeah, those of you who go to bed at 4 a.m., you can think of us as like a relay, and I'll wake up as you go to bed.
right. Well, perhaps we should say goodnight.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Good to see your faces.
Thank you, Esther, also for the moderation.
Oh,
yes. Thank you.
It was a beautiful event.